This video is for Chapter 5, AP Environmental Science. Chapter 5 is primarily looking at species interactions and also what are some things that limit the size of populations. So we're just going to focus right now on this first video for Section 1, which is looking at how do species interact with each other. And a lot of this should hopefully be review from biology. There should be some new things, but most of it should be primarily review. So you can see, for example, here in the list of major terms to make sure you understand for this section is understanding what is competition, so competing for resources. And competing for resources can be things like territory, habitat, food, mates, or reproductive rights. Remember that competition can lead to endangerment of that species or even sometimes extinction, depending on how available are the resources. So you need to be able to explain how does availability of resources influence the interaction between species. Okay, and that of course goes back to competition. So some of the other terms that you see here, again, niche is a review from Chapter 4, and it's looking at that organism's role in the environment, not the habitat, but the role. And then resource partitioning I'll talk about in just a second. Symbiosis we'll get to in a little bit, and the different types of symbiosis are commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism. Predation is not a type of symbiosis, and I'll explain why in a little bit. And then the idea of coevolution. So these are terms that you need to be familiar with. So going back to resource partitioning is basically looking at different species changing over time, whether it's behavior. In this case it's behavior, in other cases it might be adaptations that change and evolve over time that result in differences in morphology or shape, but you have different species able to basically use the same type of resource in different ways or at different times. And the idea with resource partitioning is it lessens the sort of survival pressure, if I guess for lack of a better word, the survival pressure with competition. Okay, because for example, here you have different species of warblers and they're all using the same type of tree, but they use this resource in a different way. So you see one that tends to be found on the outside part of the tree and towards the top. You see another one that's found only towards the middle of the tree, another one that's only found in the top, and then under the post-it you see again some different areas are shaded there. So that's what resource partitioning is. The key idea is it's different species using a resource in different ways, in different places or at different times. And going back to the other part, sometimes again that leads to changes or evolutionary changes in morphology. So for example, looking at the different types of beak shapes, they're able to eat different types of seeds versus insect or nectar. And again, it's just as these behaviors change, certain types of physical traits are going to be more favorable in certain environments over others. All right, predator prey. So you should hopefully be familiar with predator prey from bio. But again, predation is when one species or a member of one species eats members of another species for a food source. So the predator is the one that is doing the hunting and the eating. The prey is the one that's being eaten. But that is an interaction between species that counts. And generally that's going to be a very short-lived temporary interaction because something is going to result in becoming food. So that is an interaction. All right, going over to this section is talking about just different ways that species have evolved to kind of survive against being prey, or to reduce their chances of being prey, which is things like camouflage, warning coloration, chemical warfare, for example, where certain types of species will emit chemicals or they're poisonous, and organisms have learned over time not to eat those types of things. So just kind of for the purposes of understanding material, make sure you go over this. This is not something that I'm going to focus on a lot because it's not really part of the AP exam, but it is still kind of important to understand a little bit of it, just have a basic idea. So moving on to the other part, which is symbiosis, which is a very important part. Symbiosis is a very close and long-term interaction between two different species. So it's not short-lived like predation, which is why predation is not a symbiotic relationship. We're talking about long-term and very close interactions, constant interactions between different species. And so the summary of it is basically there's three types. The first one is, in the book, the first one they talk about is parasitism. I have it written differently on my post-it, but I'll go over here. Parasitism, and you can see that I've got pluses, minuses, and zeros. Parasitism, you've got one species that's benefiting, while the other one is being harmed, which is what the negative is meaning. So the plus means it's benefiting, the negative means it's harmed. So up here, for example, they show this blood-sucking parasitic sea lamprey that's attached to an adult trout. And so this lamprey is living at the expense of this trout. So it is doing harm, it is removing nutrients, and it's a long-term interaction. It's not, this lamprey is not going to kill the trout immediately. So it's not, this would not be a predator and this would not be prey. Okay, another type of symbiotic relationship would be commensalism. And you can see that there's a plus and a zero, which means there's no effect. So in commensalism, one organism is going to benefit, the other organism, doesn't really matter. It's either going to, it's not hurt, but it's not really helped either. There's no benefit to the relationship for that particular organism. And so, just make sure that you understand one is benefiting, one is not being hurt, but it's not being helped either. And then the other one, the last one, is mutualism, where both species are benefiting. So there's a mutual benefit to the relationship that's going on for both of them. And so, for example, we can see here with these oxpeckers that are feeding on ticks on this impala, it's basically providing a food source for the oxpeckers, and at the same time, it's helping the impala be sort of tick-free, which helps to reduce disease. Okay, and I just realized that I skipped coevolution. Sorry. So coevolution is the idea of looking at changes or of populations of two different species interacting with each other. And because they're interacting in certain ways over a long period of time, those changes that are happening in the gene pool of one species are going to impact the changes that are happening in the gene pool of another species. So up here, for example, they're showing an example of a bat that hunts through ultrasound, such as echolocation. And as the bats are evolving that trait to help increase their echolocation skills, the moth is sort of evolving a trait to help them avoid being eaten. And so it's basically, and remember, it has to do with adaptations building up over time. So that means those bats that had better echolocation skills, of course, are going to survive longer. They're going to catch more insects, such as these moths. They're going to have more food, so they're going to survive and reproduce more. So that skill, that gene that allows them to be more successful in those, or make those physical traits that are more successful, help them survive. Whereas those moths that are able to have characteristics that help them to evade being captured, of course, they're going to survive longer and they're going to reproduce. And so it goes back and forth. Okay, so this is just one of many examples.